Good evening. We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is the final meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2016, and on or before September 30th, 2017. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Harvey Epstein.
Present.
Stephen Flax.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Cecilia Hosa.
Present.
Sabil Rahman.
Present.
Helen Schaub.
Present.
Mary Serafi.
Present.
Scott Walsh.
Present.
And myself, Kathleen Roberts. Before we begin our proceedings, I want to take a moment to just thank the hundreds of New Yorkers, tenants, owners, members of advocacy groups, and public officials, including all of you here tonight, and especially those of you who testified to their personal experiences at one or more of our 5 public hearings, for participating in this process of determining rent adjustments for New York's 1 million rent-stabilized tenants. We recognize and deeply appreciate your critical contribution to the public conversation about affordable housing and to our decision-making process. Thank you all very much. The first order of business is to consider rent-stabilized hotel guidelines, consideration of proposed final language for Hotel Order Number 46 submitted by board members. I understand that our tenant members have a proposal.
Thank you, Chair. On behalf of the SRO and hotel tenants, not the rent-stabilized tenants, I propose final language in Proposal 1 for Hotel Order Number 46 was circulated to the board members and posted on the RGB website on June 23rd. I further move to adopt the explanatory statement and findings for Hotel Order 46 substantially in the form submitted to the staff and the board on June 24th. It be modified by the RGB staff after this meeting to reflect the adjustments adopted here today. The summary of the proposals for SROs: residential Class A apartment hotels, 0%. Lodging houses, 0%. Rooming houses, 0%. Class A hotels, 0%. And SRO buildings, 0%. That's my motion for all SRO hotels.
We have a second to the motion.
I second the motion.
Is there any discussion? There's no discussion, so we'll proceed to take a vote. Harvey Epstein?
Yes.
Stephen Flax?
Yes.
Shayla Garcia?
Yes.
Cecilia Hosa?
Yes.
Sabil Rahman?
Yes.
Helen Schaub?
Yes.
Mary Serafi?
No.
Scott Walsh?
No.
Kathleen Roberts? Yes.
Mary said yes.
Huh? No, she said no. All right, the motion is passed by a vote of 7-2.
Good job, Mary.
We will now proceed to consideration of rent-stabilized apartment and loft guidelines, consideration of proposed final language for apartment and loft order number 48 submitted by board members. In accordance with our tradition, the first proposal will be made by the owner representatives.
Can I go ahead and start? Yeah. I'd like to start off by thanking Mayor de Blasio for his ambitious housing plan to help address the city's housing crisis. I also want to congratulate the mayor and the city council for passing mandatory inclusionary housing, which should help to spur the creation of significant numbers of affordable units over the next 10 years. While these steps are good steps forward, there is no doubt that much needs to be done immediately. Based on the testimony presented to the RGB, the following solutions are respectfully submitted. A $300 monthly rent credit for severely rent-burdened tenants to be paid through direct city and state subsidy. A $150 monthly rent credit for rent-burdened tenants to be paid directly through city subsidy. Retroactive property tax abatement and rent freeze for all rent-stabilized buildings to tax year 2014. Retroactive water rate freezes on all rent-stabilized buildings to October 1st, 2014. Expansion of the one-shot deal program to include funding to pay for tenant moving costs, right-sizing of units, and assistance in locating quality affordable housing. Immediate expansion of the SCREE and DREE programs to an income limit of $72,500 for a household of 2, $63,500 for a household of 1. These numbers represent 100% of the area median income. Immediate outreach to all DHCR registered apartments annually with information on eligibility and how to apply to SCREE and DREE programs. Immediate reinstatement of an enhanced 421A program to ensure housing construction levels to meet the needs of our aging housing stock and our growing population. Direct city subsidy for all rent-stabilized units that are not financially self-sustaining, including unsold, non-eviction plan, co-op, and condo units. Voluntary tenants means testing to accurately assess the needs within the housing stock. Conversion of the RGB to a year-round board to better assess and determine housing solutions. These recommendations are based on the testimony that we've heard from both owners and tenants in our attempt to balance the needs of everyone in this room and those who are not in this room tonight. However, rent-stabilized housing is not an official affordable housing program, and owners still do need compensation to account for their expense growth. I am submitting for apartments and loft a 3% increase on one-year leases and a 5% increase on two-year leases.
I second the motion.
Is there any discussion?
Can we repeat the motion? I didn't hear the numbers.
All right, we need to have a repetition of the motion, please. Mr. Welch?
It is item number 6, 3% on a one-year, 5% on a two-year.
I have a question. To further summarize your proposal, I understand that it includes a 10% sublet allowance, and for lofts, 1 year 3% and 2 year 5%, and special guideline and decontrolled units 33% above MBR. Is that correct? Is there any discussion?
Hello, good evening. So, I thank Scott for thoughtful policies that he's proposed, but I think we're here for one reason, and that's to decide what rent adjustments are. I think that it's great policy. Some of the stuff we do agree from the tenant movement that we need more programs for tenants to be able to afford their rent and for the balance to be better. But we're here about landlords being overcompensated for years and decades. And it's important to remember that tenants have been struggling for tens and tens of years, and the board has ignored their plight. And so tonight, we're here to decide adjustments, not to decide what policy looks like, but to decide what adjustments look like. And I think that a 3 and a 5 is not even looking at the data that we received this year. And it's not a valid motion.
Any further discussion?
So I just want to add to what Shayla said. I do think we all support scree injury and expanded opportunities. Expanded the cap for scree injury is amazing. Ideas of people who have opportunities to keep their affordable houses is amazing. The rent stabilization is an affordable housing program, has been an affordable housing program. It is set up by government because there's a housing crisis in New York. That housing crisis exists because we lack the availability of affordable housing for millions of people who live in our city. And then by looking at the data and looking at affordability, we are clear we have an affordability housing crisis. And we support expanded opportunities around more affordable housing program, more state tax credits, and more city availability of funds. But today, like Shayla said, it's about what the guidelines are. Today, it's about what we need for our city. And today, a 3 and 5% does not represent our values. I urge everyone to vote against this proposal.
Okay, thank you. We'll now proceed is there any further discussion? All right, we'll now proceed to vote. Harvey Epstein.
I vote no.
Stephen Flax.
No.
Shayla Garcia.
No.
Cecilia Hosa.
No.
Sabil Rahman.
No.
Helen Schaub.
No.
Mary Seraphy.
Yes.
Scott Walsh.
Yes.
And I, Kathleen Roberts, vote no. The motion fails 7-2. I'm now going to turn to our tenant members of the board. I understand they have a proposal.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight and being a part of the fabric of New York and fabric of what we all believe in. What's our city going to look like for the next 10 and 20 years? And today we have one responsibility: to determine what the rent increases or decreases should be for the over 1 million rent-regulated apartments in New York. I have to say that I come here with a lot of mixed emotions about what's happening in our country, especially events over the last few weeks. The shooting in Orlando, the hate that we see, the lack of dialogue, the failure to understand. Detroit, people who are different than you, behind all that hate and fear. It's what we hear is hate and fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of what's different, fear of doing anything differently. New Yorkers have never been afraid to take new, bold steps. We can't be afraid of saying what we believe in, confronting what the issues are before us. Last week, the RGB in Westchester voted for a 0 increase for a 1-year lease and a 0.5 increase for a 2-year lease. They made smart decisions for Westchester. Today is our turn. Let's figure out what we've learned over the last few months. The last 2 years of data from HCR, we have learned owners were approved for $300 million in MCIs alone. Last 2 years. That's approximately $9.50 per room for an average 3-bedroom apartment, a $38 per minute increase for each apartment. Even with a 1-year rent freeze last year, 28% of tenants have preferential rents, are still subject to rent increases. In addition, 50% of tenants have signed 2-year leases and could not benefit for a 1-year rent freeze last year. Mortgage survey tells us that mortgage rates fell to the lowest level in history. The vacancy losses and the collection losses fell to the lowest level in history. It means landlords are losing less money every year and have less vacant apartments. The cost of taking out loans fell to the lowest level in history. This is juxtaposed to the sales prices of multifamily buildings continuing to rise in every single borough to historic levels. The price index of operating costs is a gauge where we look at owners' expenses, was one of the lowest in history, with a negative 1.2. Owners' costs are down. That's just the facts. Net operating income, another factor we look at, is the amount of money an owner keeps after paying expenses. Went up for the 10th consecutive year. And overall rental income increased by almost 5% again. We have also learned that owners were able to deregulate over 10,000 rent-regulated apartments in the last year alone. And keep in mind, that's in addition to the 250,000 apartments they have already deregulated. So now owner representatives come before the board and say we need an increase because our costs are going up. But the building owners who testified didn't say they weren't making more money than they were spending. None of them said, oh, I'm struggling, I'm not going to make it. They just said, well, I deserve an increase, without any facts to prove it. But look at the data we received. Where are the owners struggling? Not even a single large landlord. Majority of apartments are owned by a large landlord. Not a single large landlord testified. No one who really benefits by large increases came to our hearings and testified. Why didn't they show up? We asked them, why do you need an increase? Open up your books. Prove you need an increase. We know what the answer would be. And even if there are owners who are struggling, they can apply to HPD programs. We talked to them about it. There are hundreds of owners who did apply this past year to HPD housing programs. They can apply to hardship increases to HCR, and most have just chosen not to. What else have we learned? That hundreds of thousands of heat complaints were filed each year by tenants. Thousands of repair cases are brought in by HPD every year, in addition to the ones brought by tenants. Hundreds of tenants have filed harassment cases at housing court and HCR. So what we've learned here is tenants are struggling. It's born out of the data. This year's income and expense data shows that wages continue to stagnate. Community Service Society, Live On, both gave us compelling stories of data, how low-income seniors and tenants are barely holding on. Tenants are paying a higher percentage of their income towards rent. They're becoming more rent burden with every year, even last year, more rent burden. Over 20,000 New Yorkers were evicted last year. On average, 43% of those evictions came out of rent-stabilized housing. Today, in New York, 57,000 people will be sleeping in a homeless shelter. Over 100,000 fellow New Yorkers will be going through the homeless shelters at some point this year. 100,000 of our fellow New Yorkers. That ain't right. And then we can do something about it today. We can do something today. So let's remember the testimony of the hundreds of tenants who testified, probably thousands who attended our hearings. Dozens of tenants told us that the rent increases were forcing them to choose between paying the rent and paying basic expenses. Many tenants, numerous tenants told us about paying more than 50% of their income towards rent. Tenants told us that any increase would hurt them, maybe result in their eviction. We even heard from a tenant in the Bronx who was evicted. She testified how the increase resulted in her becoming homeless. And she came to the hearing just to tell us to not let that happen to other New Yorkers just like her. So I say to these owners who are struggling, apply for those hardship increases. Like you say to tenants, you have to apply for SCREE and DREE and Section 8. So government processes may be complicated, but we ask tens of thousands of tenants to do it. If you're an owner and you're struggling, there's an opportunity to apply to those programs as well. Because if you need the help, you're going to get it. And don't forget, when we ask owners about why they needed increases, they told us the real information, that their income exceeded their expenses every year, They even got angry with us when we asked them how much profit they were making, that it was none of our business. They said it's a free market. This is not a free market. We have the rent-stabilized housing stock for a reason. It is not a free market. We have the rent guidelines board for a reason. It's not a free market. This is the system where we have. And our job here is to balance the needs of owners and tenants. We look at owners' expenses and income and balance that against the income of tenants. That is our job. That is our responsibility. You know, we hear from these tenants, we hear stories about large private equity companies like Park Ash in the Bronx and Croman in the Lower East Side who are using various tactics to push out our low-income tenants. We should not be supporting that. We should not be a part of that. Therefore, I say we need a rollback now.
Mr. Epstein, do you have a motion?
So I move that we propose a negative 4% for a one-year lease, a negative 2% for a two-year lease.
I second the motion.
Before we proceed to discussion, do I understand that your proposal also includes a sublet allowance of 10%, a loft 1 year minus 4%, and loft 2 year minus 2%, and special guideline and decontrolled units 33% above the MBR?
That is correct, Chair.
All right. Is there any discussion? There's no discussion. All right. Then I'm sorry, did you have something?
I just wanted to highlight the hundreds of tenants we heard from and thank them for their valuable testimony to help supplement all the data we heard. I also want to thank them for being brave and standing in front of hundreds of people to share their testimony, to share about what their struggle looks like in order for us to make a better decision as a board. And I applaud. And I want to encourage every board member to look at the data and to tell us that this is not the right vote that we should have. A -4 and a -2.
For the record, I just want to clarify, this is proposal number 2, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and we'll take a vote at this time on proposal number 2. Harvey Epstein.
I vote yes.
Stephen Flax.
No.
Shayla Garcia.
Yes.
Cecilia Hosa.
No.
Sabil Rahman.
No.
Helen Schaub.
No.
Mary Serafi.
No.
Scott Walsh.
No.
And Kathleen Roberts, I vote no. The motion fails 7-2. We'll now proceed to proposal from myself as chair. Before I make my proposal, I would like to make a few brief comments about the process. First of all, as I said earlier this evening, I want to thank all of the hundreds of New Yorkers, including yourselves, who have come out to participate in this process. It's an absolutely critical part of our decision-making, and on behalf of myself and my fellow board members, I want to thank you. Second, I'd like to recognize and thank the staff members of the RGB for their exceptional research and analysis and coordination of our public hearings. Their professionalism and objectivity is essential to ensuring that the board's decisions are fully and accurately informed. Third, I'd like to recognize and thank my fellow board members for their support, their public service, and their dedication to a difficult task. Although we may not agree on specific rent adjustments, every member of this board is committed to the goal of creating and maintaining affordable housing in New York City. The work of this board is governed by the Rent Stabilization Act of 1969 and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974. The purpose of the law and role of the RGB is to protect tenants from excessively high rents resulting from chronic shortages of rental housing, while also ensuring that owners can pay for necessary costs and receive a fair return on their investment. Under the law, the ultimate goal is for New York City to transition to a normal market of free bargaining between landlord and tenant. However, the RGB remains in operation as long as the present competitive market exists. Data from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey, prepared by the U.S. Census Bureau, shows vacancy levels of 3.45% citywide for all rentals and 2.12% for rent-stabilized units. There's no easily applied formula or algorithm for determining a fair rent adjustment. By law, the board is required to review and consider the economic condition of the residential real estate industry, including such factors as the prevailing and projected real estate taxes and sewer and water rates, gross operating maintenance costs, cost and availability of financing and interest rates, supply of housing and vacancy rates, and relevant data from the current and projected cost of living indices for New York City. And such other data has been made available to us. The public hearings we held in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, including here at Cooper Union and Harlem, provided the RGB with an opportunity to hear from a significant number of owners and tenants, as well as advocacy groups and public officials. From tenants, we heard hundreds of deeply moving accounts of the impact of steeply rising rents and harassment, caused primarily by factors governed by state legislation over which this board has no control, such as multiple increases for major capital improvements and individual apartment improvements, dramatic increases in preferential rents, and the up to 20% vacancy increase. At the same time, we heard from dozens of owners of small buildings who are struggling to maintain their apartments and their livelihoods in face of significantly increased operating costs, especially real estate taxes. This testimony reflects the extraordinary complexity of the housing landscape in which we must determine fair rent adjustments. The public testimony and the voluminous data made available to us leads me to propose a 0 increase for one-year leases and a 2% increase for two-year leases, which is the same adjustment adopted by the board last year. I'd like to briefly state why I believe these are appropriate adjustments. The RGB's 2016 Price Index of Operating Costs, sometimes called the PIOC, gathers prices for a market basket of goods and services used in the operation and maintenance of rent-stabilized buildings in New York City, and uses these prices to estimate cost or price changes from one year to the next. This year, prices for all types of owner expenses increased, with the exception of a dramatic 41% drop in the cost of fuel to heat multifamily buildings, which alone caused the overall PIOC for rent-stabilized apartments to decrease by 1.2%, more than offsetting increases in other expenses. The RGB's 2016 Income and Expense Study examined summary data from owner-submitted real property income and expense statements. During 2014, the most current data available, owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized units witnessed a rise in income of 4.9%, while expenses rose 5.6%. Even though the percentage growth in expenses slightly outpaced growth in income, because the underlying income is higher than the underlying expenses, the owner's net operating income, the income remaining after costs, increased by 3.5%, which is the 10th consecutive annual increase in NOI. Furthermore, the RGB's 2016 mortgage report found a decrease in both interest rates and service fees to the lowest levels recorded in this report's 36-year history. These data provide ample support for a 0% increase for one-year leases. I note that the board was urged by many elected officials as well as tenants to vote to roll back rent in light of the data this year. While I understand those arguments, I think it is inappropriate to base an unprecedented rollback on one single aberrational cost factor. It is also important to consider how different owners are situated, especially for small owners. A rollback would challenge their ability to maintain their buildings, a factor we must consider as well as affordability. It is because of this aberrational cost factor that the one-year adjustment that I am proposing falls outside the range of adjustments calculated by the commensurate rent formulas presented as part of the RGB's 2016 PIOC report. According to the PIOC report, prices are projected to increase 5.9% next year, including a projected 16% increase in fuel prices, or 3.9% if the price of fuel remains at current levels. This projection amply supports a 2% increase for two-year leases. It is because of an aberrational decline in heating costs over the past year and a significant projected rise in owners' costs for next year that the 1- and 2-year adjustments that I am proposing fall outside the range of adjustments calculated by the commensurate rent formulas presented as part of the RGB's 2016 PIOC report. I considered but rejected proposing a larger increase in light of the historic trend of substantial increases in NOI and because a larger increase raises significant affordability concerns. It is established that the board can consider tenants' ability to pay rent as a factor in setting renewal lease adjustments. Data from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey shows that the median gross rent-to-income ratio for tenants living in rent-stabilized apartments is 36.4%, an increase from the 2011 Housing and Vacancy Survey when the ratio was 34.8%. This means that half of rent-stabilized tenants are paying 36.4% of their income in rent and are considered to be rent-burdened. Generally, housing is considered affordable when a household pays no more than 30% of their income in rent. The rise in gross rent-to-income ratios can be linked directly to stagnant wages and rising rents. According to the 2014 Housing Vacancy Survey, which reflects household income for 2013, the median income for rental household was $41,500, an inflation-adjusted or real increase of only 1.1% from 2010. Meanwhile, rent-stabilized tenants on the whole paid a median gross rent of $1,300 in 2014. Adjusting for inflation, this is an increase from 2011 of 5.3% for all rent-stabilized units over the 3-year period. Increasing rent burdens faced by tenants throughout New York City have led to increasing numbers of people who are unable to stay in their units. Homelessness in the city, based on data from the Department of Homeless Services, increased for the 7th consecutive year during 2015, rising by 5.6%. Finally, beyond any guideline increase issued by this board, owners have several other sources of additional revenue, including general vacancy allowances up to 20% above current rent, longevity increases, individual apartment improvements, major capital improvements, and potential increases in instances which owners have granted preferential rents. Based upon all these factors, I move to adopt the final language of Proposal 1 of Apartment and Loft Order Number 48 that was circulated to the members of the board and posted on the RGB website on June 22nd. And I further move to adopt the explanatory statement and findings for Apartment and Loft Order Number 48, substantially in the form submitted by staff to the board as of June 24th, 2016, and to be modified by the RGB staff after this meeting to reflect the adopted rental adjustments. A summary of Proposal 1 is as follows. Apartments, 1-year renewal lease, 0%. 2-year renewal lease, 2%. Sublet allowance, 10%. No vacancy allowance is permitted except as provided by Sections 19 and 20 of the Rent Regulation Reform Act of 1997. Lofts, 1-year increase, 0%. 2-year increase, 2%. No vacancy allowance is permitted under this order. Special guideline, 33% above the maximum base rent. That is my motion.
I second the motion.
Is there any discussion? Discussion?
So I want to acknowledge the chair that I really do appreciate opportunity for a 0 for a 1-year lease. I think that sets a really important message, not the rollback we wanted, but a message that says that the situation in New York is a dire situation and people are struggling. I want to echo the concerns that people in the audience raised about 2-year rent increases. That 2%, it really isn't mirrored by the data. And I understand where you're coming from, but I'm just concerned about what that message says for tenants in New York, where we know we've heard that people are struggling, have a problem paycheck to paycheck. And that doesn't acknowledge the realities of New Yorkers and the struggles that they're facing every day. So it's just a really deep concern. I know people didn't support our rent rollback, but I'm just concerned that 2% is too high.
Is there any further discussion?
I would also like to add, tenants throughout the city are struggling. We heard those stories time and time again. Not only we outnumber landlords to tenants when people were testifying, we brought data. Tenants were really showing that a rent rollback is what the city needed. I do feel that this is a bold motion to really have a different conversation as a city, that they are listening to you and your stories. They are listening to the data. It might not always feel that way, like right now, but I do feel like you guys came by the thousands at these hearings. You testified. You have prepared to share your stories in unprecedented levels, and I applaud you guys for that, and that this is actually possible because of your work.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, we'll proceed to vote on the motion. Harvey Epstein.
I'll pass.
Stephen Flax.
Yes.
Shayla Garcia.
I'm going to pass.
Cecilia Hosta.
Yes.
Sabil Rahman.
Yes.
Helen Schaub.
Yes.
Mary Sarafi.
I'm going to abstain.
Scott Walsh.
I'm going to abstain.
And Kathleen Roberts, I vote yes. I'll return then to the two pass votes. Harvey Epstein.
So I just want to say that I really value this rent freeze, and I know there's enough votes to carry this. I want to send the message that we support the 1-year freeze and really have issues with a 2-year increase, which you think is beyond what's appropriate. But at this time, I'm going to vote yes in support of a 1-year rent freeze.
Shayla Garcia.
I am going to second Harvey's remarks and also say that it does feel like we're in a different space to really have conversation, and I want the conversation to continue. I want you all to continue to have your voices heard and come out in the thousands and thousands more. But I'm also gonna vote yes on a 0 and 2.
All right, the motion passes by a vote of 7 with 2 abstentions. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Is there a second?
I second.
The motion is to adjourn, and we are in adjournment.